So, actually, just back up real quick. So remember, Paul was talking about his testimony, okay? He was sharing about how he had received Jesus and how he went into Arabia. Remember that? He went away for a couple years before talking to anyone. That's what we talked about last week. And then he carries his story on right here in chapter 2, verse 1. So chapter 2, verse 1. Then, after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, I laid before them the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. Yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Jesus Christ, so that they may bring us back into slavery. To them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. And from those who seem to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me, God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised. For he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised, worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas, that's Peter, when James and Peter and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for your word. God, I thank you for the one true gospel of the grace of Jesus Christ. Father, confirmed through the prophets and the apostles, with the foundations, God, laid down in Jesus Christ for all time, for all ages. And so, Father, we stand here as recipients of that same gospel, the same good news that Jesus Christ came to seek and to save that which was lost. And so, Father, I pray tonight that we would not be like the false teachers and cling to anything that we have to offer in and of ourselves, but that, Father, that we would turn our eyes, the eyes of our hearts, that we would turn them away from ourselves and turn them onto Jesus Christ and onto Jesus Christ alone. Be with us tonight. Thank you, and I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so I want to share with you just kind of a one-sentence summary. All right? A one-sentence summary. Caleb, you good back there, man? You get your quarter that you dropped or whatever? All right, one-sentence summary from Galatians chapter 1, all right? So this is from Galatians chapter 1. This is what we've been talking about the first couple weeks in Galatians, is this. The main truth that we've seen over and over again is that God's pleasure in you is not based on your performance for Him. You tracking with that? God's pleasure in you, His love for you, His being pleased with you, His calling you a son or a daughter, is not based on your performance for Him. Right? That's the false gospel. That's the gospel in reverse that says you must perform and be good in order for God to be pleased with you. But we want to be a little bit careful because it's also biblical to talk about living a life that's pleasing to God, right? So, for instance, in 2 Corinthians 5:9, Paul says that his aim is to be pleasing to God. Paul tells the believers in the church at Thessalonica in 1 Thessalonians 4:1, he says that their main purpose is also to please God. So, if we're saying that God's pleasure with you isn't based on your performance, and yet it's also our aim as believers to live a life pleasing to God, how can we say both things without contradicting ourselves? Well, glad you asked. Paul answers that over the course of Galatians chapter 2. So we're obviously going to read all of Galatians chapter 2 tonight. So over the next 3 weeks, there's 3 main things that Paul points to, ways that people answer the question of how we can live a life pleasing to God. So the first way that we're going to deal with tonight is in a legalistic way. Right? And we're going to define what legalism is here in a minute. But legalism fundamentally is this. It's wrong belief with right behavior. Right? And so the wrong belief is that my right behavior earns God's favor. That's what that's saying. So legalism, the false gospel we're going to talk about tonight, says you must be good in order for God to to love you, in order for God to accept you as His own. That's a wrong belief that is seeking right behavior. And then next week we're going to look at hypocrisy, right? Raise your hand if you've heard of that term, hypocrite or hypocrisy. Raise your hand if you've heard of that term. Okay, I think all of us have at some point, right? So hypocrites or hypocrisy has right beliefs but wrong behavior. You see that? So hypocrites say that they believe in Jesus, but then their lives don't measure up. And so we're going to dive into that. And so think of it like a bowling alley, right? So we went bowling for D now, and some of you had the bumpers up, but most of you didn't. I'm proud of you for those of you that did not have the bumpers up, right? So you know the gutter, right? The gutters along the bowling lane. One gutter is legalism. The other gutter is hypocrisy. And the lane that we want to be in, the gospel lane, is saving faith, which says that right belief leads to right behavior. And so over the next 3 weeks, we're going to dissect each one of those. Tonight, we're going to look at the enslaving gospel. We could say this, the enslaving false gospel of legalism. Before we kind of get into our points, bless you, before we get into our points, though, I want us to understand what that term, because that term, legalism, can kind of be, you know, a threatening word kind of thing. It's kind of a churchy word that's thrown around quite a bit. So we need to have a very, very clear idea of what we mean when we say, when we use the term legalism. So here's a definition for you from a theological pocket dictionary. Religious legalism focuses on obedience to laws or moral codes based on the assumption that obedience is a means of gaining divine favor. You see that mentality? Like, in order for God to love me, I've got to be good. In order for God to accept me, I have to be good. And so there's this mentality that, like, you know, and I hear it all the time. Like and you'll hear it too if you start inviting people to church, like, you know, or sharing Jesus with them, like they'll respond with, well, you know, I got to get some things right in my life first, and then I know I need Jesus, I know I need to be in church, but I've got to get some things right first. That's that idea, isn't it? I've got to clean up first, and then God can approve me. Then He can accept me. It's like this, right? Like when you take a shower, you don't take a bath first, right? Anybody, like you wouldn't do that, right? I mean, if you do that, you're weird, but maybe you do that, but don't do that because you don't need, right? Like it's going in to take a shower to get clean, but first you got to get clean with a bath, right? Like you can't do that. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to do that, right? And so it's a backwards. It's just not. It's not right? And so when we think about the gospel, the enslaving false gospel of legalism, it has this idea that I've got to clean up myself first, and then I'll come to God so that He can clean me. Well, wait a second. No, that's not at all what the gospel is. But that's what the Galatians were in danger of. That's the false gospel that's creeping into them. And Paul uses a story from 14 years after his conversion, from a year or so before Galatians was even started as a church. He uses a story in his own life with Titus to show that gospel has no grounding. And we're going to see that as we go into our time tonight. So I've got 4 points for you tonight. And so we'll start out on number 1. Here we go. Point number one is that Paul devotes himself to discovering the truth. He was devoted to discovery, right? Discovery, that word in and of itself implies that there's something real there to find, right? And so discovering what? Discovering what is true, what is good, what is right. Paul says it took him 14 years. And that includes his conversion. That includes time that he spent away on his own, confirming the message, the revelation that he heard from Jesus. Remember we talked about the source last week? Marshall, stop with the bottle, thanks. Remember we talked about the source last week, and how the source of Paul's message wasn't Paul, but was Jesus. It was none less than Jesus himself. And so Paul is confirming that, but then it took him another 14 years. And what was Paul doing? He was making trips. What does it say in verse 1 and 2? He went down to make sure he wasn't running in vain. What he's saying there is, look, I went down to share the gospel with these Christians in Jerusalem, not because they needed the gospel, but because I needed to make sure I was right. I needed to make sure that I wasn't just making this up on my own. 15 or so years to discovering what the truth of the gospel is. And even if you read 2 Timothy, even at the end of his life, when he's getting ready to die in prison, he asks for his books. He's in prison, and the thing that he wants is books, because those are dear to him. Because why? Because he learns of the infinite depths of God in those ways. Now look, like, we live in a culture where, like, man, you can go online and find free seminary level courses. Like, you can go online and get free, like, Bible college lectures on different websites that offer those as a ministry to lay people and things like that. And I encourage you to do so. If you're not a book person, but you should be at least one book person, because God gave us a book to read in the Bible. But like, you can go watch videos of preachers from all across the world teaching us about God. And so, like, in a room full of, I don't know, 30 or 40-ish people, like, if we all lived to 80 years old, let's say there's 40, if we all lived to 80 years old, that's collectively 3,200 years. Right? 4 times 8, 32. 3,200 years, right? You realize that if we searched the depths of the Bible and of God for 3,200 years collectively, that we would be no closer to figuring out in full who God was than when we first started. Not because we wouldn't have learned anything, but because God's that big. God is that infinitely awesome, and infinitely, there's so much to know. The Bible is an infinitely deep and rich well of information that leads us to understanding who God is. And that's what Paul was doing. So, like, this might be maybe the most important aspect of the whole thing that we're talking about tonight, isn't it? Like, take time, like, slow down, like, easy there, Turbo, like, slow down. Once, you hit 14, 15, 16, like, all of a sudden you know it all, like, slow down. Take time, let the good thing marinate inside of you and investigate. Discover what is true. Discover what is right. And so here's my encouragement to you. Like, that is counterintuitive to the age and culture in which we live, isn't it? Like, you can have any piece of information you want right now. I mean, like, we don't even need school teachers almost anymore, because you can just Google, right? I mean, just go on to Google, and find out things like that. But we do need school teachers. I'm not saying that's true, but I'm saying, like, the culture is almost in a point where it's like, man, you can find out any piece of information you want online. I mean, like, we have more access to more information than at any point ever in history at our fingertips. Like, we don't even have to go to a really nice library to find those things. It's right here. And so here, and not only that, but coupled with the culture that we live in, the culture of outrage that we live in. I mean, just think about, like, the recent news cycles that we've heard about. Think about the college students, high school students up in, the Catholic high school students, boys up in Washington, D.C. And the news cycles got a hold of that. And man, there was death threats. I don't know if you heard about that. They were waiting. There was a March for Life, and they were waiting on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And this Native American came in between two groups that were going at it. And people thought that, like, these guys were, like, jeering at the guy. And I'm not saying that the teenagers didn't, that they did everything right. I mean, they might have done, like, at least, like, where's the chaplains at? Like, take them away from that. But whatever. That's not the point. But the point is like one of the boys who wasn't even involved in it, it was said that he was the guy face to face with the Native American, and his family started receiving death threats that day. Death threats from media, from people that got a hold of that. Like, we live in a culture where it's like, oh, I see it, it must be true. Like, it's on Google. Like, Google said it must be true. It's on Wikipedia, it must be true. Like, you have a homework assignment in high school, you go write a research paper, like, most of your first sources is Wikipedia. Like, that's a rule in college, is that you can't use Wikipedia as a source, because it's unreliable. But what are we saying? What I'm saying to you is, listen, look, spend time patiently digging into the depths of who God is. Spend time discovering for yourself. And I'm telling you, it's rewarding. Like I'm blessed that I have a job. I get paid full time to steep myself in the Bible, and have a Bible college degree, and in master's program in seminary where, like, I'm immersed in it. But like But I'm telling you, like, immerse yourself in the culture of discovering who God is. And it's a slow, probably take it slow. Like you might get upset, like, man, I've been reading the Bible for a few days and I just don't understand a lick. Well, yeah, because you're 12, you know? Like, slow down, you know? Like just keep at it. Persevere through it. And by the time you're 20, man, it'll yield rewards far greater than anything else that you could have spent your time doing during those years. And then by the time you're 30, I mean, you'll be preaching, you'll be on missions and things like that for the gospel of Jesus Christ because you steeped yourself in the depths and in the glory of who God is. So, devote yourself to what Paul devoted himself to. Discovering the truth. Don't settle for anything less. Don't cheapen the grace of the gospel of Jesus Christ. All right. Number two. Paul defends the truth. So he spends a lot of time discovering the truth, and then he defends the truth against devilish falsehoods. Verses 3 through 6. We're gonna camp out here for a second. It says this, but even Titus, who was with me, so they went down to Jerusalem. Titus was with them. He wasn't forced to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. Like, that's the exact same issue that is going on in the Galatian church right now. And so Paul uses the example of Titus, saying Titus was not a Jew, but there were some there telling him he had to be circumcised in order for him to be a Christian, but we didn't let it happen. Paul was defending. Remember what Paul said about the false gospels? If anyone preaches a false gospel, what he said in chapter 1, he said it 2 times. If anyone among you preaches a different gospel, let him be, you remember the word? Starts with the letter A, rhymes with cursed. Accursed, yeah, let him be cursed, let him be condemned. Because the message itself is condemned. Because it's from the one who is cursed, from Satan himself. And then later, Paul, in chapter 3, we're going to see Paul asks the rhetorical questions of the Galatians. He says, oh, foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Who has you under this spell? It's this devilish doctrine, the false, enslaving doctrine of legalism. And so I want to hone in real quick, verse 4 and 5. And I want us to see what this false gospel of legalism really is all about. So, zoom in real quick. What is this false gospel of legalism? 3 things. Number 1, the false gospel of legalism is disguised as truth. It's disguised as truth. Look at the language that Paul uses. These false brothers, they were secretly brought in. They slipped in to spy. Like, they didn't come in with big flashing neon signs saying, yo, we're going to bewitch you with some false doctrine. Like, they didn't come in with signs on their t-shirts saying, like, here's the false gospel of legalism, follow us for enslavement. They didn't do that. They came in. Paul writes to the Corinthians, when he writes to the Corinthians, he tells them that Satan often disguises himself as an angel of light. So, like, what does that mean for us? Man, we got to be on defense, don't we? Which means at least, bare minimum, we got to know what we're looking for. We're going to have in-tune ears. It's like, I was talking with the praise band earlier, like, about how far we've come. Some of them have been with us, for like 3.5 years, trying to play at least off the bat in the praise band. Like where we are today is like, man, it's a miracle that we are here where we're at today. Like, but by God's grace, like, I was commending them for their perseverance. But like today, man, if there's a wrong note being played, man, we stop practice and it's like, yo, you playing the wrong note, man, or you doing the wrong thing, right? Like, they know what they're listening for now. And so as gospel people, like, we need to be so in tune with, that's why discovering the truth matters, because we need to be so in tune with the false gospels, or we need to be so in tune with the true gospel that when the false gospel creeps in as light, as truth, we can be like, no, bro, we're on to you. We know you're of the devil. We know that this is a devilish false doctrine, that it's dangerous. So it's disguised as truth. The second point about legalism is that it's a drudgery of bondage. Look at what Paul says in verse 4. They slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ so they might bring us back into slavery. So this false gospel living life in order for God to approve of you based on the law, it doesn't lead you to freedom. It leads you to bondage. And it's a drudgery. It's like a burden on your back that weighs you down, man. And it's a drudgery. Like when I hear that word, like I think of like a car engine and motor oil. Like if you don't change your motor oil out, the oil's gonna go bad and it's gonna slow your car down. It's gonna junk up and things like that. It's gonna bring a drudgery into your vehicle if you don't take care of that problem. Well, the same thing, man. If we don't weed out the false gospel of legalism, if we live in order to please God based on my performance, it will be a drudgery that Paul uses the word slavery for. You know the word, they sneaked in, they slipped in, they spied out. Those are all forms of the same word, parasitos in Greek. You know what word we get from that in English? Transliteration? Parasite. It's like it's a parasite that has come in and has latched on. And it won't let go. And if we're not careful to get rid of the parasite, man, it's going to take us over. It's going to spread. And it's only going to lead to the third thing, which is an utter despairing of hope. Why does living according to the law lead to despair? Because we are all sinners. Look, you and I, we don't measure up to the standard of God's perfect righteousness. In fact, the Bible says even our good works are as filthy rags. Why? It's because God's infinite purity and holiness is so infinite, so big, that like even the good that we do is filthy to Him. You know, it's a little bit of a more vivid imagery even than that phrase, even than that phrase, filthy rag. It has to do with like how a woman would clean herself when she's on her monthly cycle. And like that's like a cleaned up version of what that phrase is trying to communicate. Like our good works are like these dirty, filthy rags before God. It's a stench to Him. And yet how dare us bring to God, look at my good works. No. It despairs us of any hope because we know, innately we know, that we don't measure up. And so the legalistic gospel leads us only to a hopeless drudgery of life. Joyless, happyless living. False gospel of legalism. Paul defended against the devilish doctrines. Number 3. Paul makes documentation of the dependability of the gospel of grace. Here's the light. Here's the good stuff. Paul moves on and he says, instead, we didn't circumcise Titus, who was a Greek. He didn't have to be circumcised. We met up with James and Cephas, that's the Greek name for Peter. That's Peter, James and and John. We met up with them. And when we met up with them, their ministry was to the circumcised, meaning Jewish people. They were in Jerusalem ministering. And God had called Paul to minister to the uncircumcised, to the Gentiles. And Paul says, what did they do? It looked like these are the apostles. Like, surely if Paul's wrong, don't you think either James or Peter, like Peter's a big deal, right? Or John wrote the book of John, like, don't you think they would have called him out and said, hey, look, that's not the gospel that we're preaching. But instead, what does Paul say that they did in verse 9? They extended the right hand of fellowship to him. Meaning that, and he says it up there in verse 8, 7, and 8, meaning this, why did they extend the right hand of fellowship? Because God called James, Peter, and John to the circumcised to do what? To preach the gospel of grace. Not works plus grace, but of grace alone. If we believe in Jesus, then we're saved. I don't clean myself up to go get cleaned by Jesus. The whole point of faith is because I'm unclean and I need someone to clean me. And that's Jesus Christ. And Paul says, I did the same thing. He went to the uncircumcised and preached the same gospel. So they had this corroboration together. They had this apostolic witness together, this approval, and it was unplanned, right? They didn't powwow about this beforehand and then spread. No, they were doing this separately, and then they came together, and Paul confirmed it with them, and what happened? They were in fellowship together. They were preaching the same gospel. Paul documents that, look, this gospel, the gospel of grace, the one true gospel that the Galatians had walked away from, or were walking away from. Remember, they were in danger of deserting the gospel. That gospel is the only thing that we can depend on for salvation. Because I've got nothing to bring to the table. I've got nothing. I don't have a righteousness of my own to bring. I only have sin and filth and wretchedness. And in my uncleanness, Jesus said, I love you. Even while Aaron's a sinner, I love him and I'm going to die for him. Even when Jose's yet a sinner, I love him, I'm going to die for him. Even when Abby's a sinner, I love her and yet I'm going to die for her. Even when Jesse's a sinner, I love him and yet I'm going to die for him. Like, you realize that we serve a God who knows you at your worst and says, I love you anyway. So much so that I'm going to send my son to die for you. I mean, that's the dependable gospel that we have. Number 4. Last one. Paul delights in dynamic, grace-filled living. Oh man, we're going to get to this. We're going to get to this at the end of... Paul often splits his books pretty evenly, like half is doctrine, half is practice, like here's how we live in light of that. But much of Galatians is setting the table for the last chapter or two of how then should we live in light of that. But in Galatians 5, there's a whole passage known as the fruit of the Spirit, right? Flowing out of... It's not that works don't matter. It's not that obedience doesn't matter for Christians. It's just that we got to get the order right? We can't be good and then God will accept us. It's the opposite. God accepts us because of Jesus, and then based on that, we live a life of obedience. Look at verse 10. Paul says this, they asked me to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. I was joyful to do it. I delighted in the duty of obedience to God. Do you see the opposite gospels there? The one leads to despair, the false gospel of legalism, working so hard in order to earn God's favor. That leads to despair and hopelessness. But this gospel, the one true gospel, leads to delight and eagerness, a joyfulness, a happiness. And so as we close our time tonight, we have to ask ourselves, am I living in the dynamic or the power, that word dynamite, the dynamo, the dynamic of the power of this grace-filled gospel, which gives me, when God gives me the Spirit, am I living life according to the power of the Spirit that God has put in me? When we get to 2 weeks from now, the third part of this chapter 2, Paul says this in Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ. There's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. That's what he's communicating. That he lives not according to his own power, but another power that's in him. The power of the Spirit, the power of God. And it's a delight for him. John Piper calls it the dangerous duty of delight. That because we as Christians delight so much in God and so much in the life that he gives to us, to obey him, man, we'd be fools to turn to some other gospel. Paul was eager. He delighted in obeying God as he took care of them.
Everyone needs compassion, love that's never friendly. Let mercy fall on me. Everyone needs forgiveness, kindness of a Savior. The whole world